Hello again, everyone. My name is Louis Ruggiero. Welcome to the King Messiah Project. This is the conclusion of a three-part series titled Refuting Jews for Judaism on Isaiah 53, a refutation of Rabbi Michael Skobac. Now, I need to respond to two more objections made by Rabbi Skobac regarding Jesus the Messiah being the subject of Isaiah 53. After I provide my responses, I'll prove that his understanding of the chapter is simply not biblical. Let's listen to Rabbi Skobac's next objection.
Mark 16. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Throughout the New Testament, Jesus always tells his disciples, don't tell anyone I'm the Messiah. Every time he does a miracle, what happens? Look at Luke chapter 8, verse 53. And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. It was a young girl who died. But he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up!" Her spirit returned, and she got up at once. Then he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. And throughout the New Testament, Jesus is constantly telling people, don't tell anyone about this miracle. Don't tell anyone I'm the Messiah. Yet to the Romans he says, hey, up front, everything in the open, no problems. Yet Isaiah says there was no deceit in his mouth.
Jesus told his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah for a reason. If his people were honestly seeking the truth, they would have been able to figure that out for themselves. Now let's move on to Rabbi Skobac's final objection.
Finally, the major problem for Jesus is Isaiah 53, verse 10. It says, what? That the servant would see his seed, he will see his offspring, and prolong his days. Well, certainly when it comes to prolonging his days, Jesus loses coming and going. If Jesus were an ordinary mortal, then he didn't prolong his days. He died at 30 or 33 years of age. That was not a very long life. And if Jesus was not a mortal human being, if he was an eternal, mighty God, then it's irrelevant to talk about prolonging his days. You can't prolong infinity. So the idea of prolonging the days of Jesus doesn't work out. More problematic is he didn't have any children. It says he will see his seed, meaning he'll have children. So Christians will say, well, having children Jesus fulfilled because of all his disciples. They clearly take the idea of having children in a spiritual fashion. Everyone hear that? That's pretty clear. They'll say, yes, Jesus did have children, figuratively. So the problem with this is that the verse in Isaiah uses a very, very stark and clear word. Isaiah uses the word zerah. Zerah is the Hebrew word for seed, and it's the biblical word for sperm as well.
Rabbi Skobac makes the argument here that the Hebrew word zerah always refers to literal and physical offspring, and that it cannot be used in a figurative, allegorical, or spiritual sense. Well, he's incorrect. And here are a few examples.
Isaiah 57 verses 3 and 4 says, But draw nigh hither, ye sons of the sorceress, the seed, Zerah, of the adulterer and the whore. Are ye not children of transgression, a seed, Zerah, of falsehood? Malachi 2:15 says, That he might seek a godly seed, Zerah. And in Genesis 3:15, we have the seed of the serpent, where God told the serpent, And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. Now I really don't believe that the seed of the serpent here are little baby snakes. Oh, one last thing about prolonging infinity. Jesus' deity did not perish at the cross. His humanity perished at the cross. 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 18 says, For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit.
Since I've responded to, I believe, all of Rabbi Skobac's objections to Jesus being the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, let's find out who he believes is the subject of the chapter. Let's listen in.
If you had been reading the whole book of Isaiah from the beginning, you would know something. Had you read the rest of the book of Isaiah, especially, by the way, the chapters immediately preceding this chapter, the book of Isaiah makes it very clear who the servant of God is. It makes it painfully clear who the servant of God is. And not just the book of Isaiah, the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible tells you who the servant of God is. Let's look at a few passages in section A. Who is normally referred to as God's servant? Well, Isaiah 41 verses 8 to 9. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, you whom I've taken from the ends of the earth and called from its remotest parts and said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and have not rejected you. Who is the servant? Israel. Isaiah chapter 44 verses 1 to 2. But now listen, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel whom I have chosen. Thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you from the womb, who will help you. Do not fear, O Jacob, my servant, Yeshurun whom I have chosen. Isaiah chapter 44 verse 21. Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I have formed you, you are my servant. 44 verse 21. You getting the point here? Remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you, you are my servant, O Israel. It sounds like a broken record. Isaiah 49, this 49 is getting very close to our chapter. Isaiah 49 verse 3, he said to me, you are my servant, Israel. Now, if you had been reading the book of Isaiah, and you came to chapter 53 now, would it come to your mind that, oh, maybe the servant here is Israel? You would have a right to assume that. So you would be within your rights to say, oh, Isaiah here is again referring to the Jewish people.
It appears that Rabbi Skobac is attempting to convince his audience that Israel is the my servant spoken of in Isaiah 53 because Israel is called my servant prior to Isaiah 53. But let's listen in some more, just to make sure.
What did chapter 53 of Isaiah talk about? It spoke about the servant who was despised and rejected and hated, but what will happen? They'll be exalted and raised very high. And we're going to see that this is a description of the Jewish people throughout the Bible.
Yes, that's what he's saying, even though the Targum of Yonathan states in Isaiah 52:13 this, behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. And even though a number of major Jewish sages interpreted Isaiah 42 verse 1 as referring to the Messiah, behold, my servant whom I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. Now let's go back for a moment and see what standard Michael Skobac went by when he tried to disqualify Jesus as the subject of Isaiah chapter 53. Let's listen in.
If Christians assert that Isaiah chapter 53 is a description of Jesus, then what we would expect is that the information in Isaiah 53 would correlate with what we know about Jesus. This is the claim that we have to examine. Does the life of Jesus as we know it fit the picture painted by Isaiah chapter 53?
Using the equal weights and measures standard, let's follow the same approach that Michael Skobac used in his attempt to disqualify Jesus as the subject of Isaiah 53 and see if Israel meets the description of the chapter. Let's assume for a moment that Rabbi Skobac is correct, that Isaiah was describing Israel in Isaiah 53. Well, we know that this unnamed suffering servant, based on Isaiah 53:9, has done, well, let's put it up on the board. It says, and he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. So we have that the servant has no violence and no deceit. Isaiah also says that the servant has knowledge and is righteous. Let's take a look at Isaiah 53:11. It states, he shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. So, besides having no violence and no deceit, this servant has knowledge and is righteous. And finally, according to verse 12, this unnamed suffering servant made intercession for transgressors. This is what it says, and made intercession for the transgressors. So, if Rabbi Skobac is correct and Isaiah is describing Israel in Isaiah 53, then Israel is described as follows. It must have no violence, no deceit, knowledge, it must be righteous, and it must make intercession for transgressors. These are the 5 requirements that must fit Israel. But are they true for Israel? Let's take a look. First, Isaiah 53 verse 9 teaches that this servant has no violence, right? Well, What does Isaiah say about Israel having violence? Remember, the Hebrew word for violence is Hamas, which is unrighteous violence. Does Israel have no violence, no Hamas? Not according to Isaiah 59 verse 6 regarding Israel, which reads, "Their webs shall not become garments, neither shall they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and the act of violence, Hamas, is in their hands." Once again, the servant in Isaiah 53 cannot be Israel. Second, what does Isaiah say about Israel having deceit? Regarding Israel, Isaiah 59 verse 3 states, "For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies, your tongue hath muttered perverseness." Perverseness is deception and deceit. Since Isaiah 53 verse 9 teaches that this servant has no deceit, and Isaiah 59 verse 3 tells us that Israel has deceit, Israel once again cannot be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Let's continue. Third, Isaiah 53 verse 11 reveals that this servant has knowledge, correct? Well, what does Isaiah say about Israel having knowledge? Isaiah 5:13 states, "Therefore my people are gone into captivity, because they have no knowledge." Again, Israel cannot be the subject of Isaiah 53 because, in this example, it has no knowledge. Let's continue. Number 4, Isaiah 53:11 informs us that the servant is righteous. Well, does Isaiah describe Israel as righteous? Let's take a look. Regarding Israel, Isaiah 1 verse 2 says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me." Verse 4, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters." And Isaiah 48 verse 8 refers to Israel as a transgressor from the womb. So, is Israel righteous according to Isaiah? The answer is clearly no. Once again, this proves that it cannot be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And finally, Isaiah 53 verse 12 teaches that this servant made intercession for transgressors. Right here. Does Israel make intercession for transgressors? What does Isaiah say? Isaiah 59 verse 16 states, "And he saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his arm brought salvation unto him, and his righteousness it sustained him." According to the prophet, God could not find a qualified intercessor in Israel. Yet, the servant of Isaiah 53 verse 12 makes intercession for transgressors. This is the final proof that Israel is not the subject of Isaiah 53. Now that Isaiah disqualifies Israel as the suffering servant, what does he say about the Messiah? For example, does he have knowledge? Is he righteous? Actually, Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 5 provides the answer to both of these questions in the affirmative. Let's take a look. "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins." So, contrary to Rabbi Michael Skobac and Jews for Judaism, when it comes to the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 53, Israel is disqualified. Meanwhile, Jesus the Messiah qualifies. And finally, as I conclude this three-part teaching, allow me to suggest to everyone that if you found that this information has been worthwhile, please feel free to pass it on to others, especially to our Jewish friends, and encourage them to do the same. On behalf of the King Messiah Project, this is Louis Ruggiero saying, God bless you all.